Greetings everyone, my name is Dropsik and I will be your host in the first episode of the Military in Painful Details. As this is the first material that I'm uploading to this channel, it would be worth giving a short introduction, who I am, what is the purpose of this channel, and what can you expect from my materials. First of all, I would like to apologize for the quality of my English. As you can surely guess, it's not my first language, so I'm asking for your patience and understanding. Although my vocabulary is not that bad, the pronunciation leaves much to be desired and I am aware of those shortcomings. I hope that any language deficiencies will be rewarded with substance, with merit, and over time, with a bit of work and practice, the quality of my voice will improve. But in order not to make life miserable for a viewer who just wants to watch an interesting film, information about me and my channel can be found at the end of the video. Meanwhile, we will move on to the first episode of the series dealing with history of one of the most interesting duels in the naval battles. Bismarck and its short but turbulent career is a story that has captured the attention of marine enthusiasts almost since its birth. It is also a story about a ship that introduces a unique split among enthusiasts, dividing them into two groups: those who consider it the best battleship in the world, and those who consider it a complete waste of time and materials. One faction believes it was the pinnacle of battleship evolution, well armored, well armed, fast, invincible. The other faction believes that it was a badly designed ship, badly armored, underarmed, and ill-suited to the tasks it was supposed to perform. One faction diligently cultivates myths about this ship, and the other, in turn, rejects all arguments without much consideration if there is any merit in them. In this material, I will try to make a thorough analysis of all aspects related to Bismarck: the political turmoil and the revival of the German Navy, the state of the Royal Navy on the eve of the war, and the possibilities it had in the clash with the latest Kriegsmarine ship. A description of the tactical and technical characteristics of the main actors of both sides, consideration of decisions taken by the commanders, and many other details and nuances that may help us to get a proper assessment of the German ship. Operation Rheinübung, Bismarck's only raid, is an interesting story, mysterious and dramatic, set at a critical time in the war in the Atlantic. The action takes place on a cold ocean, hazy and violent, where mighty warships exchange blows, neither asking for nor giving mercy. It is a story that captures the reader's imagination with its drama, dynamism, and heavy weight of symbolism. The Royal Navy's most powerful battleship is torn apart by an explosion, but within a week, its adversary would also sink, torn to pieces by Britain's vengeful dreadnoughts. In its brutality, it is beautiful and in a way romantic story that deserves the attention it receives. So I decided to set sail for the cool May waters of the Atlantic and followed the Prelude to, as well as the Rheinübung operation itself, Bismarck's only rally. The end of World War I brought a very heavy blow to Germany. Their fleet, a source of pride, was scuttled in Scapa flow almost in its entirety. 52 ships, including battleships and beautiful battlecruisers, have either gone to the bottom or were washed ashore. The fleet, which in 1918 was the hotbed for revolutionary riots, now committed a mass suicide in a desperate gesture of protest. Ludwig von Reuter, on June 21st, 1919, the day the Treaty of Versailles was supposed to be signed, ordered his ships to sink one by one into the cool waters of the bay. Of the 74 ships anchored in Scapa flow, 52 were sunk. The sinking of the High Seas Fleet is an interesting event worthy of its own separate analysis. However, let me discuss this event briefly in order to get a fuller context of an event that had a significant impact on the shape of the Kriegsmarine. The presence of the High Seas Fleet in Scapa flow itself is controversial. The original peace arrangements assumed that the German fleet would be disarmed, but would remain in German ports. However, this did not happen, and the fleet was ordered to proceed to the Royal Navy Scottish anchorage. This fleet was led by Admiral Ludwig von Reuter because Admiral Franz von Hipper refused to surrender his ships in this way, considering it, rightly, a violation of the previous arrangements. The German ships entering Scapa flow were not in the best condition. The morale of the crews was very low, and the whole situation was reminiscent of the revolutionary chaos prevailing in the Russian fleet at the time. Orders issued by officers were cancelled by revolutionary councils, and then whatever wanted, when wanted, was carried out by the crews. High Seas Fleet officers were preparing a contingency plan in case Britain wanted to seize their fleet by force. The British were aware of the plans of the German commanders and prepared an operation to intercept the German ships before they sank themselves. For various reasons, the interception operation prepared by the British was postponed, and in the meantime, Admiral Reuter, at 10 o'clock on June 21st, hoisted the signal flags on SMS Friedrich der Grosse, ordering the assembled ships of the German fleet to comply with paragraph 11. This term was used to describe the signal indicating the decision to sink the High Seas Fleet ships moored in the Scapa flow. Thus, the second most powerful navy in the world drowned itself in cold, murky waters of Scottish anchorage. Ironically, in accordance with the wishes of the then decision makers, this gesture of resistance of protest gave birth to another myth about the invincibility of German fleet, which was defeated by treacherous stab in the back, but not in combat, never in combat. On the basis of this myth, Nazi Germany forged steel for the revival of their war fleet many years later. After the sinking of his fleet, Ludwig von Reuter was imprisoned in Britain, despised there, but hailed as a hero in his own country. He was held in custody until January 1920, when he was released, after which he returned to mainland. There, however, glory and applause did not await him. He was quickly forced to resign from his position due to the drastically reduced size of the German fleet. On June 21st, 1919, the High Seas Fleet ceased to exist. The Treaty of Versailles contained draconian provisions for the future German armed forces, including the navy. The Germans were allowed to keep 6 battleships of the Deutschland and Lothringen class, otherwise known as the Braunschweig class, completely obsolete pre-dreadnoughts with very little value in the era of super-dreadnoughts. To this were added 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers and 12 torpedo boats. The possession of submarines was forbidden, and the existing ones were to be scrapped. Construction of all new ships was ordered to stop immediately, and then they were ordered to be scrapped. The fleet was to have 15,000 sailors, including 1,500 officers. When building new ships to replace obsolete ones, with the minimum age of a ship eligible for replacement was 15 years, a very limited tonnage had to be respected. 10,000 tons for armored ships, that is battleships in fact, 6,000 tons for light cruisers, 800 tons for destroyers and 200 tons for torpedo boats. The Germans, as was said, were not allowed to build submarines or buy them from foreign shipyards. In addition, the German fleet was charged with tasks, or the German navy was charged with the tasks of clearing certain territories of mines. It was forbidden to build fortifications, and it was forbidden to build or use radio and telegraph stations. Lastly, the victors submitted a list of 900 war criminals to be brought to trial, including some of the U-boat commanders. The situation in the early 1920s, therefore, did not look very promising for the German navy. But it wasn't just the fleet that had been placed under such a severe containment. The army and the air force were also drastically reduced in size and bound by the same strict regulations. The High Seas Fleet was no more. The ships that remained formed a fleet too small, too weak, and too obsolete to be anything more than a coastal defense fleet, and not a very large one at that. The staff was significantly reduced both among sailors and among officers. Submarines became a forbidden type both in terms of design and construction. Any new ships were not to exceed the displacement of 10,000 tons, which is roughly the size or the level of a county-class heavy cruiser. In addition, the country was engulfed in revolutionary chaos, which also did not facilitate the functioning of the navy. Many of the senior officers were involved in all sorts of political intrigues such as the Wolfgang Kapp coup, which later resulted in more than 200 officers being dismissed or taken into early retirement, not to mention ordinary sailors who were simply removed from the ranks of the navy. In the chaos, however, one thing was clear: disarmament of Germany was not to take place. Weltpolitik has not been stopped forever, it has only been delayed. The German politicians did everything in their power to circumvent the obligations and limitations imposed on them by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1922, the German shipyards AG Vulkan, Germania Werft and AG Weser founded the company IVS, Ship Engineering Office, in the Netherlands, which was primarily intended to design and build submarines. This investment was secretive and officially unrelated to the government of the Weimar Republic. The officers were in charge of the Winterarbeiten, winter exercises. The winter months in Baltic, where the small German fleet mainly operated after World War I, were marked by inactivity. The Baltic froze and the ice hindered all operations. Thus, officers devoted themselves to theoretical work, the Winterarbeiten, creating something similar to a semi-secret naval academy for the staff. Many of these theoretical exercises involved submarine operations. We could point to one such work by a former U-boat commander as the source of the later Wolfpack tactics refined by Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz. In the mid-1920s, the post-war economic crisis led to the consolidation of German industry. Struggling with bankruptcy, small companies were bought out by large corporations, which in turn got rich by manipulating money from the Reichsbank. The consolidation of industry was later proved to be an advantage of the Nazi leaders. It was easier to control heavy industry, consisting of only a handful of enterprises, by awarding or denying them lucrative government contracts. In this difficult period for ordinary German citizens, the armed forces enjoyed huge financial support from the government. Of course, this did not go quite hand in hand with the disarmament arrangements of the Treaty of Versailles. During this period, the German armed forces received 100 million marks in gold and thus not affected by the negative impact of raging inflation at the time. In 1921, the keel was laid for the first new ship built after losing the war, the light cruiser Emden. Completed in 1925, the cruiser, based on the Karlsruhe class plans, was neither modern nor impressive. It displaced 5,300 tons standard and slightly less than 7,000 tons full displacement. It exceeded the limited displacement required by the Treaty of Versailles. Its construction was greatly influenced by the Naval Inter-Allied Commission of Control, NIACC, a special team of experts tasked with controlling whether Germany complied with the provisions of the treaty. It was this committee that blocked the use of elements from ships intended for scrapping in unfinished World War I wartime ships. And also this commission did not agree to the use of the twin gun turrets. Thus, the new Reichsmarine cruiser was armed with obsolete single guns in open mounts. Intended to train future Reichsmarine sailors, Emden was more of a rehash of what has been forgotten than a step into a new design philosophy. More interesting solutions were used in the next three ships, the Königsberg-class light cruisers. Both the Emden and the Königsberg-class cruisers, sometimes referred as K-class, were designed and built as replacements for obsolete pre-World War I cruisers. They were interesting ships with an interesting arrangement of the main artillery, 3 triple turrets, 1 at the bow, 2 at the stern in the superposition. In addition, they were armed with a strong torpedo battery. Later, they were also fitted with a catapult, allowing them to carry and operate a seaplane. The ships were equipped with diesel engines and 6 boilers. The engine room managed to produce 65,000 shaft horsepower and accelerated the ships weighing 7,800 tons of full displacement to a speed of 32 knots. The ships were almost entirely welded, which allowed the significantly safe weight. Well, in the era of Washington Treaty and the restriction of Treaty of Versailles still imposed on Germany, this was of great importance. The disadvantages included, above all, light construction and overloading of the ships. With more serious storms, deformations of the bow plating were reported, a problem also known to American and Japanese designers, but also in some way familiar to the Royal Navy. The ships had stability issues, again a fairly common problem in the Washington Treaty era. The Königsberg class was a relatively capable class of cruisers. Despite that, used extensively for training and courtesy visits pre-war, but it also took a much more active part in World War II than Emden. In the meantime, lighter ships were also built. However, it should be emphasized that Versailles and Washington Treaty weren't the only factors that did limit the size of the new ships. There was also the issue of finances. The K-class cruisers were basically equal to other light cruisers in terms of displacement, but their construction took quite a long time and resources. Similarly, the construction of torpedo boats was also constrained more by finances than by treaties. Soon it became increasingly difficult for the future allies to enforce the limitations of the treaty. In 1927, the ACC, Allied Control Commission, prepared a report in which it questioned the effectiveness of the German disarmament process. In the same year, the Berliner Tageblatt, a German daily newspaper, exposed the connection that the state-owned companies and firms had with the film company Phoebus, which was responsible for producing propaganda materials for the government. These reports shed some light on what was going on behind the stage. The Germans, despite the treaties, were still working on building a war machine, but this time in secret. The Paris Air Agreement of 1926 allowed Germany to start manufacturing aircraft, provided that they were intended for civilian use. Oddly enough, the German Dornier passenger planes had very slender fuselages, extremely uncomfortable for carrying passengers and luggage, but very useful for high performance of a possible bomber aircraft. The German company IVS, meanwhile, designed and sold submarines for, among others, Turkey and Japan, which, in case of Japan, which was actually supposed to be responsible for ensuring compliance with the Treaty of Versailles. German engineers disguised as ordinary citizens traveled to Finland to also work there on the construction of submarines and to conduct appropriate tests at sea. It can be seen that the disarmament of Germany did not proceed as the victors of the last war, and in particular France, wished. But for all its importance, it was all just an introduction, an exercise. The real problem, of course, came when Germany was trying to design and build ships to replace the old dreadnoughts. These Panzerschiffe, known to us as pocket battleships, will be discussed only very briefly. I am planning an extensive material dedicated to them due to their unusual design and quite rich combat history, so let's just introduce their most basic features here. The beginnings of this class came from the provisions of the Washington Treaty. Thanks to not entirely clearly established regulations, German constructors were able to mount 2 triple turrets with 280mm guns on a cruiser-sized hull, thus creating a hybrid between a heavy cruiser and a battleship. We could say in some way a light battle cruiser. The design work was quite long, the project was difficult to finish, but in the end it was successful, and those beautiful ships formed the Deutschland class. The first ship, Deutschland, was later renamed as Lützow in 1940. The other two ships, Admiral Scheer and Admiral Graf Spee, differed slightly from the lead ship, primarily in the shape of the forward superstructure and the arrangements of armor, but were similar enough to be considered a single class. The creation of these ships had unforeseen consequences. France, which had no ship capable of countering the new pocket battleships of the Reichsmarine, decided to respond with the new Dunkirk class, armed with 8 330mm guns, armored to withstand 280mm shells, and capable of just below 30 knots of speed. They were designed to catch up with the pocket battleship, withstand its blows, and sink it with more powerful artillery. There is also some evidence to the fact that American supercruisers of Alaska class were influenced by the appearance of Germany's newest warships. In 1933, Deutschland underwent her final trials and was commissioned in April that year. Soon after, another two pocket battleships joined the Reichsmarine. Meanwhile, in Germany, the political and economic situation was deteriorating, thus slowly bringing Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to power. The year in which the pocket battleship christened Deutschland was commissioned is also the year in which Adolf Hitler, on March 23rd, became the Führer, thus ending the short era of the Weimar Republic and beginning the equally short period of the Third Reich. Taking the above into consideration, the plans for any permanent disarmament of Germany, then Weimar Republic, should be viewed as futile and ineffective. Germany also reduced World War I war reparation payments, first to 50% and then to 30% of the agreed amount. Air Force grew from 200 planned aircraft in 1932 to 2,000 in 1935. The army was to grow to 300,000 soldiers and would also start conscription, which was prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. As for the Reichsmarine, the matter was a little more difficult. The Navy was fighting for resources with the Army and Air Force, and for many reasons it was not in the first place, it was not a priority. For many Germans, the Navy, the High Seas Fleet, was a symbol of defeat and a source of revolutionary unrest that was the catalyst for German surrender. However, in 1935, Germany and Great Britain signed the London Naval Agreement, which granted the German Navy the right to own a fleet the size of 35% of that of the Royal Navy. The restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles ceased to apply and were replaced by the Washington Treaty. So it was 35,000 tons of displacement, limited gun caliber, etc. Interestingly, the Third Reich was granted the right to build submarines and even allowed to build them above 35% limit, provided that their tonnage would be deducted from the other allowed types of warships. The next class of German battleship, almost as interesting as Deutschland class, has an even more complicated design path. Originally, construction of Scharnhorst on Gneisenau began in February, curiously on Valentine's Day, 1934. Originally, it was to be a continuation, evolution of the Panzerschiff design, but with increased displacement, approximately 20,000 tons. However, construction was stopped in July due to the information about the Dunkirk class from France, and political turmoil around the London Treaty and the naval agreement between England and Germany. It was decided to change the design. This time they were supposed to be officially 26,000 tons ships armed with 9 280mm guns in 3 triple turrets. Larger calibers were also considered, but Hitler, eager to improve his relations with Britain, refused to increase the caliber. This modification was planned for later. The relaying of the keel for the change design took place in 1935, in May for Gneisenau and June for Scharnhorst. Both the Deutschland and the Scharnhorst classes beg for a broader discussion both of their design history and their wartime fate. They were unusual ships with very unusual features. They combined creative ways to circumvent political restrictions, mostly by using new technologies such as welding, naval aviation, modern fire control system, and innovations in the propulsion system. Then, instead of glancing over their history in this material, discussing the fate of Bismarck, we will talk about Deutschland and Scharnhorst classes extensively and in painful detail on another occasion. But despite the innovations and many efforts to squeeze as much as possible on the limited displacement, there was also a huge negative impact of the High Seas Fleet's suicide in Scapa flow. German designers in many ways were still stuck in World War I thinking, where thick side armor, excessive internal division, and strong medium caliber artillery were considered necessary. In 1935, with the end of the Weimar Republic, the Reichsmarine was also disbanded and it was replaced by the much more sinister sounding Kriegsmarine. The First World War did not strengthen Britain's position among world powers. Although the country was not in ruins, the negative effect of the exhausting war was keenly felt. In addition, Great Britain and the Royal Navy had to face the sad fact that they were no longer the greatest naval power in the world. The Royal Navy had to shuffle a bit on her throne to make room for the rapidly expanding US Navy while keeping an uneasy eye on the young but ambitious Imperial Japanese Navy. During World War I, Britain lost over 7,700,000 gross registered tons from its merchant navy. It also lost many warships, including 2 dreadnoughts, 3 battlecruisers, and 11 older battleships. Not to mention hundreds of smaller vessels and horrible human losses, whether military or civilian. Great Britain emerged from the First World War victorious but very heavily bruised and bloodied. The end of the First World War found the Royal Navy very powerful, but at the same time its fleet was rapidly aging and maintenance costs were just as quickly becoming unbearable for the Empire's badly damaged economy. HMS Dreadnought itself and all the following classes of battleships equipped with 12-inch guns were intended for scrapping. At the same time, new warships were much larger and much more expensive than pre- and early war ones. As before World War I, when the battlecruiser type was introduced, a different solution was needed, but this time one that was bitter pill to swallow. Great Britain must have realized that it was no longer the undisputed leader on the seas and oceans. Both the mighty USA, with her massive economy, and Imperial Japan, boosted by her almost effortless gains in World War I, had massive naval expansion programs underway, especially the former getting ready to challenge the primacy of the Royal Navy. The USA planned to maintain the freedom of the seas and oceans by guaranteeing the flow of American-made goods to all interested countries, and the sea blockade strategy imposed by Great Britain during World War I was a threat to such free movement of goods. The US Navy was therefore motivated and expanded to guarantee that such a situation would not take place and American goods would reach everywhere, regardless of whether the countries were at war with each other or not. The US Navy planned 6 Lexington-class battlecruisers and 10 new dreadnoughts, 4 of the Maryland class and 6 of the South Dakota class, not to be confused with later South Dakota battleships from World War II era. The Japanese plans were based on the 8-8 program, 8 battleships and 8 battlecruisers, although at the time the exact characteristics of the ships planned for this program were unknown. The solution chosen by United Kingdom consisted of two elements. First was the assumption that the USA would remain an ally of Great Britain for the foreseeable future, and thus could have a fleet as powerful as the Royal Navy. There was no need to compete with an ally. While this exposed Britain's imperial policy to potential clashes with the US Navy, the alternative was an arms race that Britain had no chance of winning at the time. The parity with the US Navy was quietly allowed. The second element was political constraints. In this case, there were three treaties. The Washington Treaty, also known as the Five Powers Treaty, signed in January 1922, the Treaty on London, also known as Limitation and Reduction of Naval Armaments, signed in April 1930, and the Second London Treaty, signed in March 1936. Post-World War I societies were reluctant to continue spending on armaments. This sentiment constituted a huge political capital to be wrestled for parties advocating reductions in armaments spending and the introduction of a more isolationist, peaceful policy. In 1920, the Republicans in USA won the presidential elections and, as part of their program, focused on reducing spending on armaments, especially naval ones. In July 1921, President Warren G. Harding convened a World Conference on Naval Disarmament. Although the first move belonged to the US, the UK planned to hold such a conference independently of the US. Harding was just a bit faster. This conference would, as its conclusion, deliver the Washington Treaty. How the treaty findings were reached is, like the history of Deutschland and Scharnhorst classes, excellent material for a separate video, and so we will just talk about the most important points here. For our considerations, the final provisions of these treaties are important, but let us limit ourselves to the ships of the line or the battleships or the capital ships. Thus, the Washington Treaty stated a 10-year break in the construction of warships from battleships to submarines. The maximum displacements of the new battleships is limited to 35,000 tons. The limit of the battleship fleet was 525,000 tons for the UK and USA, 315,000 tons for Japan, and 175,000 tons for France and Italy. Main artillery caliber was limited to 16 inches, 406 millimeters. Due to the 5-5-3 formula and the post-Jutland battleships, Japan was able to complete the construction of Mutsu and thus regain two Nagato-class battleships considered post-Jutland designs. The US completed the construction of two more Maryland-class ships, thus having three ships of this type in service. Britain, on the other hand, was allowed to add two more battleships to HMS Hood, with regulations of the treaty in effect as to their characteristics. They were described as Hood-class modified, but those two ships would become Nelson-class, and so post-Jutland battleship classes would also mimic the ratio 3-3-2. Another rule was to ban on selling, renting, and building new battleships for other powers. There was also a clause allowing the modernization of existing battleships, provided that the displacement after modernization did not increase by more than 3,000 tons, and that the modernization will be limited to improving the defense of the ship, armor, anti-torpedo bulges, watertight bulkheads, etc. France and Italy were granted permission for slightly more extensive upgrades. For the Royal Navy, the biggest problem was the 10-year break in the construction of the new battleships. Unlike the US and Japan, not to mention France and Italy, Britain had an extensive private shipbuilding industry that had just received a mortal blow. Two shipyards, Armstrong and Beardmore, went bankrupt very quickly in the 1920s, while the others barely made ends meet. For Japan and the US, this was not such a big problem because the shipbuilding industry was in some form state-owned and thus less dependent on private contracts. It would be maintained despite the lack of orders, but they also had problems. Those problems, however, had limited impact on the economy of both those countries, in contrast with Great Britain. Another document limiting armaments, the London Treaty, was a nail in the coffin of British shipbuilding. The ban on building new battleships was extended until 1936. The rest of the rules were mostly for lighter ships like cruisers and submarines, with additional rules for aircraft carriers. In addition, it defined the concept of standard displacement slightly better, but still far from crystal clear, quite beneficially to the UK, and clarified when exactly an obsolete ship could be replaced. The Second London Treaty, in turn, contained one of the most important rules from our point of view. Newly built battleships could only have 14-inch guns, which is 356mm caliber. Such guns were installed on King George class battleships, and North Carolina class battleships were planned to be armed with this caliber. However, the treaty provided an escalation clause. When one of the signatories felt threatened by the non-compliance to the treaty laws by the other power, that country could increase the caliber of his ship's guns to 16 inches. This clause was applied by the Americans to the North Carolina class. Unfortunately, King George class battleships were too advanced in construction for this rule to apply. These three treaties shaped the Royal Navy in the period leading up to the World War II. Most painful was the fact that the Royal Navy was no longer a two-power navy. For much of the interwar period, British planners anticipated future conflict with Japan. The Japanese Empire, growing in strength, planned to oust the Western powers from what it considered its sphere of influence in the Far East. In 1919, the Grand Fleet was disbanded and the Atlantic Fleet and Home Fleet were formed, to which the Mediterranean Fleet was later added. The Home Fleet was placed in reserve, leaving two active organizations. The Mediterranean Fleet was considered the war fleet, the main combat force should war break out, and was stationed in Malta. Malta offered a great strategic position where the fleet could react to the conflict in the Atlantic or the Pacific with almost equal speed. Of course, the downside was the size of the anchorage. On a small island, after all, Malta was rather crowded. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Fleet was renamed the Home Fleet. In 1936, the Home Fleet consisted of only HMS Nelson, HMS Rodney, and HMS Royal Sovereign. All the rest of the capital ships, including the few remaining battlecruisers, were placed in the Mediterranean Fleet, where they were tasked to counter the threat from the Far East. This was the disposition of the Great Britain's fleet at the outbreak of World War II. So, where was the drama of the Royal Navy? Confined by the treaties and a flimsy economy, it would compete, but just barely, with only one power, Japan. Meanwhile, the Kriegsmarine grew up under their noses and Regia Marina in the Mediterranean Sea. So, the Royal Navy, assuming that France took care of the Italian Navy, would still have to face two hostile powers, Japan and Germany, which unfortunately it no longer had the strength for. Reality turned out to be even worse. France was quickly knocked out of the game, and Japan, when it finally decided to join the war, dealt a very hard blow to the US Navy at Pearl Harbor. Thus, the Royal Navy had to face up with the navies of Japan, Germany, and Italy, and also make sure that warships from the now occupied France were not put in German service. This concludes today's episode. As I mentioned at the beginning, a few words about me and my channel. This is my second serious YouTube channel I've created. A few years ago, I started recording these materials at the suggestion of some of my friends and acquaintances. I created a channel for the Polish community that turned out to be relatively popular in the modest scene of my country nautical enthusiasts. Occasionally, there were voices in the comment section urging me to try my hand at English channel, and Military in Painful Details is the result. The topic of military equipment, and the history of warfare has accompanied me since I was a child, when my father introduced me to this topic. This passion faded a bit in my teenage years, but it came back with a vengeance when I finished my studies and became a little older. My channel will be mainly dedicated to warships, as my heart belongs to them, but we will occasionally deal with planes and tanks. Unfortunately, my interests only concern the end of the 19th and 20th centuries, so unfortunately, sailing ships enthusiasts will have no use for my channel. I always joke that if something needs wind to move, it's not a real warship. Moving forward, my channel aims, as the name might suggest, at quite detailed analysis. I don't really plan to create short materials where in a few minutes I will summarize the history of a given design, plane, tank or warship. Military in Painful Details will always start the discussion by showing the context in which a given war machine was created. Often, before we move on to discussing technical data of a certain unit, we will spend up to several hours on a discussion of the political and economic, strategic and tactical conditions in which the idea for a given machine was born. It will be no different in this series, the first episode of which you had the opportunity to see. And finally, I am not, to put it neatly, a thoroughbred historian. I'm just a very passionate guy about the history of war machines. I prepare my materials based on books, articles, documents, and archives that I've read. At the end of the series, I always include a list of the works I used to create my films. My task is to analyze available texts, compare them with each other, draw certain conclusions, and present them to the audience in a relatively interesting form. So far, I have gathered around 11,000 subscribers on my Polish channel who, I would guess, appreciate this type of entertainment. That's why I think English-speaking audience will also find something for themselves here. I would also like to point out that the material about Bismarck is the first one I have prepared, so it is not as elegantly and coherently arranged as future materials that will appear on this channel, but I think that I am making up for it in interesting content. And that's it for the welcome party. I try to respond to all comments, so if you have any questions, comments or something to add, please feel free to write in the comment sections. But for now, this concludes today's episode of Military in Painful Details. I hope that you had a very nice time watching my material, and I'll be back with another one soon.